Hello and welcome to my channel. Rhino here. Today, we're heading back to Off the Kirb Ministries to look at their video on Noah's Flood. Will they bring anything new to the table, or will they just regurgitate the same tired creationist tropes? The only way to find out is by liking and subscribing. That's right, if you watch this video all the way through while not subscribed and without liking, then you won't be able to discern whether these arguments are ones that you've heard before or not. So for the sake of your mental capabilities, go smash that like button. God, I'm cringe.
Did you know that every ancient culture has its own account of a worldwide flood?
No, I didn't know that. Mainly because it's not true. Japan, for instance, doesn't seem to have a flood myth. And also it depends on what you mean by ancient culture. Native Americans, for instance, were not a monolithic group. Some of them did have myths involving floods, but others did not. But I know from watching ahead that you treat them as one single culture when describing various flood myths. Why is that? Culturally speaking, depending on how we're counting, there are about 10 distinct culture groups just in North America. Arctic, subarctic, northwest coast, west coast, plateau, Great Basin, southwest, plains, northeast, and southeast. And within these larger culture groups were individual tribes that, while they may be culturally similar, were still distinct from their neighboring tribes. On Wikipedia's list of flood myths, they have 19 entries under the North American heading, but there are hundreds of tribes. Are there some flood myths that just aren't represented on Wikipedia's list? Almost certainly. Are there also some tribes that just didn't have a flood myth in the first place? Quite possibly, but hard to know for certain. But do you know what all of the flood myths that we do know about have in common? They originate in areas near water. People aren't very original when making stuff up. Usually made-up ideas will be based on things that we have experience with. And given just how different all these flood myths are, the idea that there really was a worldwide flood because a bunch of cultures have myths about floods is just completely unwarranted. Like, here's a chart put together by Answers in Genesis, which compares several flood myths with various aspects of the biblical flood. They've got 20 myths and 12 characteristics of the myth that could or could not match up with the Genesis story. Of the myths that they looked at, they found 124 points of agreement with the biblical story out of a potential 240 points of agreement, or just over 51%. They've listed 13 as partial matches and 103 as misses. And this is 20 myths out of several dozen potential myths. It stands to reason that they would have picked the closest matches, and this is the best that they could do. What's more, it gets worse when you get into the details. For instance, they have destruction by water as one of the biblical ideas that could be represented. But we're talking flood myths here, right? Isn't every flood going to be water, pretty much by definition? Well, as it turns out, no. The Egyptian flood myth involves Ra's daughter slaughtering so many people that it creates a lake of blood. And this lake of blood is listed by Answers in Genesis as being a partial representation of the idea of a flood with water. I'd say that that would actually be a miss, not a hit, but on top of that, they say that this flood is a full representation of the idea of universal destruction. But in the Egyptian story, Ra was angry that people weren't following his laws anymore, so he sent his daughter, Sekhmet, to kill a portion of them to teach the remaining people a lesson. His daughter got carried away, though, and kept going on past what Ra wanted, causing Ra to have to intervene to stop her before it was too late. So the goal of that one was partial destruction, not through flooding, but through killing. What actually happened was the direct killing got out of hand, which then caused the flood of blood. But even then, it was stopped before everyone was killed. And AIG says that that is a full representation of the idea of universal destruction. There's also the fact that some of these myths, like the Polynesian ones, were definitely influenced by Christians. In Polynesia, Christian missionaries were present well before any attempts were made to document the Maori oral traditions, and several of the details of their most disastrous flood myths were incongruous with other well-documented aspects of their ethics and religious ideas. And the Russian flood myth? As far as I can tell, that's just the Christian flood myth as told by the Russian Orthodox Church. There's nothing I can find about a Russian flood myth that doesn't have its roots in Christianity. And yet, according to Answers in Genesis chart, less than half of the biblical ideas of the flood are represented in the Russian flood myth. Maybe AIG knows something I don't. My inability to find something doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, but this is not the first time I've looked, and I always come up with nothing here. We are 5 seconds into this guy's video so far. And I haven't even gotten around to mentioning that his messed up audio is actually my fault. To avoid potential copyright issues, anytime a video I respond to uses music, I remove it. But the tools I use to do that are imperfect, so there's always some leftover glitchiness to the audio, and I've seen people attribute that to the original video rather than me, so I just want to own up to it. Also, since I seem to be feeling rather windbaggy today, I'm going to skip his description of the various flood myths. Most of them aren't even close to the biblical version, and while he does describe the Epic of Gilgamesh, he fails to mention that that one actually predates the biblical one, meaning that if all these stories exist because they were passed on and evolved from one original story, then that story would be more likely to be the Epic of Gilgamesh than the Bible. Anyway, I'm skipping ahead. Feel free to watch the original video, link in the description, to make sure that I don't skip anything crucial.
Okay, you probably know by now that I am a Christian, and I don't believe in any of these stories, but I believe in the biblical accounts of Noah.
Oh, are we doing boom mics in the frame now? I can never keep up with all the YouTube trends. Okay. Yes, we know you're a Christian, and you believe the biblical story despite citing a story that the Bible directly copied from when composing its flood narrative. You don't really need to tell it, well, I mean, I guess for the new viewers you do, but I already knew that.
But I am going to make a statement for you, and I want you to tell me what you think happened. Either all of these stories are just coincidences, or there actually was a real worldwide flood, and all of these ancient cultures are somehow trying to explain this massive event with their own campfire tales.
Or, third option, and one that I've already touched on in this video, people tell stories about things that they're familiar with. So people living in areas that sometimes experience flooding are perfectly likely to develop a story about a flood at some point. It's not coincidence so much as that's just how telling stories works.
By the way, if you are interested in hearing about ancient civilizations, you will struggle to hear some information I want to share with you in a future video. You'll find it very hard to find this information anywhere else.
I debated whether or not to skip this, but decided to leave it in. If you are learning information from a YouTube video that is extremely difficult to find anywhere else, then that's a huge red flag that the information is false, especially given the fact that I've never seen this channel cite any sources in any of their descriptions. I know that, as a YouTuber, I'm not a trustworthy source of information. There is nothing stopping me from making a video where every piece of information I provide is just made up whole cloth. And there's no reason you should just assume that I'm telling the truth. So every time I do any amount of research on a topic, whatever sources I use to reach the conclusions that I'm presenting go in the description, and recently I've been putting them on screen as well. Hell, where possible, I try to use sources that are freely available to anyone that clicks on them. That's a bit difficult with academic journals, where commonly the ones with the highest reputation are locked behind paywalls, and sadly it goes against YouTube policy to recommend that you use Sci-Hub to bypass those paywalls, so definitely don't do that. Anyway, all this to say, don't trust YouTubers, including me, especially when they don't cite their sources. If one specific YouTuber is the only place on the entire internet where you can learn a piece of information, it's a safe bet that whatever they told you is just bullshit.
But right now, the evidence for a worldwide flood is not just in every ancient culture, but across the entire face of the world.
Well, that'll come as a surprise to all the geologists who have concluded that a worldwide flood would have been physically impossible, a category that even includes at least one young Earth creationist geologist for the record.
Take a look at this. This is the Grand Canyon. And it doesn't take a genius to see that this beautiful natural wonder of the world was caused by a huge amount of water cutting through the deep parts of the canyon.
I mean, yeah, that is what caused it, but not as part of a worldwide flood, rather through normal erosional processes working over the course of the last 5 to 6 million years, mostly in the form of the Colorado River flowing through it, with some help from other processes like wind, rain, and the merging of pre-existing canyons.
And do you not think that the layers and layers of rock, which we can see today, show evidence of rock layers being laid down extremely quickly by a worldwide flood?
No, I do not think that. You showed in your own video 3 of the different types of rock that can be found in the canyon: sandstone, shale, and limestone. Shale in particular requires relatively calm water in order to form, with gentle currents bringing in sediments. The Bright Angel Shale of the Grand Canyon in particular shows evidence of episodic sedimentation. That is, the deposition of sediments was not a constant. There were periods of deposition and periods that lacked deposition. And some of this evidence is found in the trace fossils indicating the activity of plants and animals, things like digging burrows and forests growing. You know, the kinds of things that would have been impossible during a worldwide flood? But then it's not just the Bright Angel Shale. We have different types of layers all throughout the Grand Canyon, which all represent different environments that existed when those layers were forming. And there are all sorts of environments, from forest to marine to desert and more. The idea that these environments, complete with their own flora and fauna, could have formed and then immediately been wiped out by Noah's flood is just patently ridiculous.
Especially when we can see organisms crossing over into different parts of the sediment, as if they were buried very quickly, as opposed to each layer being formed slowly over millions of years.
Notice that the organism pictured when he said that we have organisms spanning multiple layers was a tree. It's also telling that, if you aren't familiar with creationist arguments, you would think that the tree he's showing can be found somewhere within the Grand Canyon, since that's what we are currently talking about. But it is, in fact, an in-situ tree that is in Joggins, Nova Scotia. And given how low effort this channel's videos are, it should come as no surprise to learn that the image they used is literally the main image that accompanies the Wikipedia article for Polystrate fossil. Not a single animal fossil has been found that spans multiple layers like that, but if all these layers were formed in the flood, you'd expect that to be the norm rather than the exception.
But guys, would you like to see a memorable picture which you will never quite unsee? This fish was caught red-handed eating its lunch. So come on now, how can we explain this other than the obvious explanation that this fish was buried suddenly in a huge amount of water?
Oh no! The fish was buried in a huge amount of water? That must have been horrible for it. Everyone knows that fish just can't stand being buried in water. Like, just look at these poor guys. They're completely buried in water and they couldn't be more freaked out about it. Joking aside, I know he means sediment, but that's the sort of lack of attention to detail I've come to expect from the content mill that is off the Kirb Ministries. But yeah, a fish was buried rapidly before it had a chance to finish its lunch. That's a thing that can happen without there being a worldwide flood. Could have been a mudslide, a volcanic eruption, hell, it could have just died because the fish it was trying to eat was too big and it got stuck in its mouth, leaving it unable to spit, unable to swallow, unable to eat anything else, and potentially unable to push water past its gills, thus choking to death. Since we know that organisms can die in mudslides, volcanic eruptions, and choking to death without there being a worldwide flood, then the reasonable inference here is that this fish did not, in fact, die in a worldwide flood.
However, this wasn't the only time that the fossil record proved the biblical story to be true.
Not the only time? It's not even a time. That fossil just proves that a fish died with another fish in its mouth. That says nothing about whether or not there was a global flood.
On the 29th of May, 1953, Edmund Hillary became the first man to climb Mount Everest. And it's rumoured that when he reached the very top, he found seashells.
It's not a rumor. He brought back limestone samples from Everest that did indeed contain marine fossils. Why you even need to go to Everest to find marine fossils on mountaintops is just beyond me. Is it just because it's the most sensational? Well, Leonardo da Vinci wrote about marine fossils on mountains back in the 14 and 1500s. And what's more, despite writing well before people like Steno and Lyell wrote their foundational works in the study of geology, he pretty much hit the nail on the head with his explanation of how they got there. Quote, "The shells, oysters, and other similar animals, which originate in the sea mud, bear witness to the changes of the earth round the center of our elements. This is proved thus. Great rivers always run turbid, being colored by the earth, which is stirred by the friction of their waters at the bottom and on their shores. And this wearing disturbs the face of the strata made by the layers of shells, which lie on the surface of the marine mud, and which were produced there when the salt water covers them. And these strata were covered over again from time to time with mud of various thickness, or carried down to the sea by rivers and floods of more or less extent. And thus these layers of mud became raised to such a height that they came up from the bottom to the air. At the present time, these bottoms are so high that they form hills or high mountains, and the rivers, which wear away the sides of these mountains, uncover the strata of these shells, and thus the softened side of the earth continually rises, and the antipodes sink closer to the center of the earth, and the ancient bottoms of the seas have become mountain ridges." His picture of plate tectonics was rudimentary to be generous, but given that plate tectonics wouldn't become a scientific theory for another 400 to 500 years, that is entirely forgivable. But even he wasn't the first to just make the observation of marine fossils on mountaintops. 12th century Chinese polymath Chu Shi wrote of stone animals on mountaintops that used to be at the bottom of the sea. At any rate, the seashells used to be on the seafloor until tectonic activity pushed them up into the mountain ranges. That's how they got there.
I wouldn't mention this rumour normally, but it has actually been fact-checked by real geologists and real paleontologists.
Oh, so the reason you were saying it was rumored is because you're just doing one of those, "this is a wild claim that's so hard to believe that I wouldn't share it with you until after it was fact-checked," sort of things. Except, in this case, the claim is so unremarkable that its geologic explanation has been known since before geology was really a science. Also, if it was previously rumored, but then it was successfully and thoroughly fact-checked and found to be true, it then ceases to be a rumor. It's just a fact at that point. So your framing it as a rumor is entirely unnecessary, unless you're trying to go for that whole "they don't want you to know" bullshit, which, yeah, given that the title of this video is "Scientists Are Trying to Deny This Happened," is exactly what's going on here. Present a mundane claim that isn't contested at all and has a well-understood explanation that has nothing to do with Noah's flood, as though it were some controversial discovery in order to make people think that there's more going on here than there really is. Standard conspiracy theory tripe, really.
Who have also found shells on the top of Mount Everest. But not just shells, but fish fossils too. So over to you now. You explain to me, what are fish doing 29,000 feet above sea level?
Easy. They weren't always above sea level. The Himalayas are made up of rock that was formerly sea floor, which was uplifted as the Indian continent collided into the Asian landmass, a process that is still ongoing today, causing the Himalayas to continue to grow.
The obvious answer is the Bible's account of Noah's flood.
Being obvious and being correct are two different things. Often, the obvious answer is incorrect.
It says, "And the waters prevailed exceedingly on the earth, and all the high hills or mountains in other versions, under the whole heaven, were covered."
The Bible also says that making goats look at striped sticks while breeding will make their babies striped, speckled, and spotted, so forgive me for not taking it seriously when it talks about covering mountains with water.
One piece of evidence, which is staring every single one of us in the face, is the fact that Earth is covered by 71% of water.
Okay, you might want to sit down for this one. This might come as a shocker to you, but 71% is less than 100%. I know, it's difficult. Take a moment to recover if you need to, but it is true.
And it's no secret that water doesn't just disappear, but it's recycled over and over again through the water cycle. So which do you think makes more sense? The opposing view, from those who do not believe in the Bible and the flood, who say that the reason water covers the majority of the world is because it arrived on comets? Or do you think it makes more sense that all of this water is a remnant from a worldwide flood?
I mean, of those two, the comets. They make way more sense. Water is one of the most abundant molecules in the observable universe, and comets are mostly made of ice. Also, star-forming regions are full of water, with new planetary systems likely containing several thousand of Earth's oceans worth of water at a minimum, which was less than the researchers expected, but still significant. So, on the one hand, we have a hypothesis that says that water, being one of the most abundant molecules in the universe, was delivered to the Earth through bombardment by comets, astronomical objects that we know exist and are mostly made of water, and which modeling has shown would have been more abundant in the early solar system. And on the other hand, we have the hypothesis that says that the water was put here by a magic sky wizard who got mad at all the butt stuff people were doing. Yeah, I'm gonna take the comets, of course.
And actually, all of these ancient cultures could be onto something.
Yeah, they could be onto something. And the thing that they are onto is the fact that flooding is a thing that happens sometimes.
But listen to me. It's not just Christians who believe in a worldwide flood. Graham Hancock, who is not a follower of Jesus Christ, also believes the evidence for such an event is undeniable.
Well, given that the first sentence of his Wikipedia page is Graham Bruce Hancock, born 2nd August 1950, is a British writer who promotes pseudoscientific theories involving ancient civilizations and hypothetical lost lands, I'm gonna go out on a limb and suggest that maybe he's not the most reliable of sources. Even if we ignore that, his education amounts to a degree in sociology, and his career before he wrote pseudoscientific books involved him being a journalist. Now, I'm not one to say that you can't find good information presented by people without relevant qualifications. I'd have to shut down my YouTube channel if I did say that, as I have zero qualifications. But if you're going to present an idea that runs entirely counter to the scientific consensus, you'd better know what you're talking about. And somehow I doubt that a journalist with a sociology degree knows enough about geology to effectively counter the consensus of geologists.
And there is evidence for cataclysmic flooding across North America, dated to the Younger Dryas, between 12,800 and 11,600 years ago.
Well, now I want to know why you're even listening to this guy. Even in his model there, he's saying that the flooding happened before the universe was created in your view. Also, notice that he said cataclysmic flooding across North America. Even if I grant whatever he's saying, that just means there was a big flood in North America, which is a far cry from a worldwide flood.
This is a meteorite. It's an iron meteorite. And it was found in Oregon, and it's sacred to the Native American people of Oregon. But it didn't come from Oregon. It came from 100 miles further north. It came from the Canadian ice cap, and it was carried in an iceberg on those floods from Canada into Oregon. Then the iceberg melted away, leaving this 15-ton oriented iron meteorite.
That is the Willamette meteorite. It was moved from its impact site by glacial activity to an ice barrier in the glacial Lake Missoula. When the ice barrier broke, it was carried by the resulting flood to its final resting place before its discovery. The same applies to a bunch of other large boulders in the area that he brings up, so I'm going to go ahead and skip that part. Suffice it to say that it's a bit more complicated than an iceberg carried a meteorite from Canada to Oregon in a flood.
Erosive enough to create this fossilized waterfall called Dry Falls in just 2 weeks.
Yeah, so I'm having a hard time finding anything on the formation of dry falls specifically, but they are part of an area of the northwestern United States that was devastated by a series of likely around 100 massive catastrophic floods that happened at the end of the last glacial maximum. These are known as the Missoula floods, and there are a couple of things we can learn from these floods that, unfortunately for creationists, wind up disproving Noah's flood pretty conclusively. First off, while they were massive, covering an area of about 30,000 square kilometers, which is about the size of South Carolina, you'll notice that South Carolina does not, in fact, occupy the entire surface of the Earth, taking up a mere 0.006% of it. So the fact that these floods that geologists will happily call massive and catastrophic didn't even manage to cover 1/100th of 1% of the surface of the Earth, and yet they left such a distinct signature everywhere they did cover, tells us that the rest of the Earth was not subject to similar flooding at the same time. Second, the depositional pattern of these floods shows us that a massive flood takes sediment from high places and deposits the sediment in low places. So earlier when talking about fossils on Mount Everest, I debated whether or not to bring this up and decided not to. Well, you basically forced me into it at this point. If Mount Everest was covered by Noah's flood, the flood would not have swept mollusks up from the seafloor to deposit them on top of the mountain. Rather, it would have carved away at the mountaintop and deposited the resulting sediment deep on the ocean floor. So, contrary to the picture that creationists paint of a pre-flood Earth not having much in the way of tall mountains, with all the mountains forming in the flood, it turns out that such a flood would have actually had the opposite effect, serving to smooth the Earth out and wear away at the mountaintops. There's also the fact that papers will compare the channeled scablands, the area affected by the Missoula floods, with the canyons on Mars that were also formed through catastrophic flooding, but when looking for differences, they will use the Grand Canyon as a contrast point, because the features of the Grand Canyon were so very obviously formed by a relatively small volume of water working over millions of years.
Nature is fractal. We know that what nature does on a small scale, it also does on a large scale. So go to the beach, watch the tide go out, and you will see little current ripples on the beach. And those ripples might be an inch high and a few feet long. But there are current ripples on the Camas Prairie in the Pacific Northwest that are on a completely different scale.
That's not a universally true statement, but in this case, yes, those land features are ripple marks caused by catastrophic flooding. But once again, this serves to disprove the global flood idea. You see, current ripples are by far the most common bedform type on the surface of the Earth, because they happen basically anywhere there's water, and water is involved in most depositional environments. So if the entire surface of the planet were covered with water, and massive flooding forms massive current ripples, then you'd expect to find them all over the place, would you not? Well, guess how many locations on the Earth have this notable feature that is indicative of large-scale catastrophic flooding? 3. I get that creationists see evidence of a large flood and then extrapolate from that this must have been Noah's flood, but Noah's flood would have had to have been 5 orders of magnitude larger than the Missoula floods, and somehow it only left key evidence in 3 relatively small locations on the whole of the Earth? Nah, man. These massive catastrophic floods are doing way more to disprove Noah's flood than I ever could. Like, honestly, I watched through this video before starting the scripting process, something I don't do very often, and I thought for sure that this part of the video would be the hardest for me to deal with because I know the Missoula floods are a thing, and I was worried that I wouldn't be able to properly articulate the fact that evidence for one localized catastrophic flood does not translate into evidence for a worldwide flood, but it turns out that worry was completely unfounded because the literature, without even trying to combat Noah's flood, just completely wipes out the very idea of a worldwide flood. At least partially because the things that make these regions so notable is just how incredibly rare they are. Now, I'm skipping the next bit. It's an interview with the same guy on a podcast where he talks about how the idea of the Missoula floods was a controversial one in geology because it didn't fit in with the uniformitarian expectations of the early 1900s. Which is true. It was a very controversial proposition. But because science is a process that adapts to incorporate new data, eventually the consensus came to what is now the modern conclusion, that the Missoula floods were a thing that happened, and that while uniformitarianism generally holds true in most environments, catastrophic events can also have a geologic impact. Hancock, the journalist playing at Geology and Archaeology, promotes the idea that the Missoula floods were larger than is currently thought, and in fact were large enough to wipe out the civilization of Atlantis that lived in North America at the time, with the handful of Atlantean survivors floating their way over to the Middle East to teach them how to farm. Okay, he doesn't call it Atlantis, but he's clearly regurgitating that same basic idea, which, side note, along with the ancient aliens idea, has its basis in racism. Brown people can't figure out agriculture or architecture, so it must have been Atlanteans or aliens that taught them. Also, for this information, I'm citing an article in The Conversation written by archaeologist Flint Dibble, and I just have to point that out because that is now my favorite archaeologist name. I'm picturing him teaming up with Indy for the adventures of Indiana Jones and Flint Dibble. He already wears the hat, guys, come on. And at least half of Digital Hammurabi has told me that he's 100% awesome and highly recommended. So, he has a YouTube channel. I'll leave a card to his video talking about the time he debated Hancock on Joe Rogan's show, so if you want to see Hancock thoroughly discredited, go give that a watch because, as I mentioned earlier, I'm skipping the rest of this bit.
If you remember one word from this entire video, remember this one. Prepare. Because here's the thing, even in Noah's day, there were doubters.
What do you mean, even in Noah's day? Wasn't the wickedness of people during Noah's time the whole point of that story? Wouldn't that include doubters? Like, if I sincerely believed that an all-powerful being was going to torture me for all eternity if I didn't obey its rules, I'd do my best to obey its rules in order to avoid that torture. So the act of being wicked kind of definitionally came with doubting the existence or abilities of that being.
There's nothing new under the sun. When I was a little boy, do you know, I used to sing a hymn, a children's hymn, and it went like this. Mr. Noah built an ark. The people thought it such a lark. Mr. Noah pleaded so, but into the ark they would not go. And Jesus Christ himself said, for as in the days that were before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered into the ark, and they knew not until the flood came and took them all away. So shall also be the coming of the Son of Man be.
So it looks like we are again getting an apologist who is promoting the idea that is surely a heretical one, that Noah was attempting to save people by offering them a place on the ark, with the people laughing at the idea that there would be a flood and so winding up being drowned by God. This idea is nowhere to be found in the Bible, hence why I had to quote a children's song to get there, but this has given me an insight into where this idea comes from. You see, a core aspect of Christianity is the idea that they will be persecuted. Jesus said that his followers would be persecuted, and so did Paul. It goes so far that one can conclude that if you aren't being persecuted because of your faith in Christ, then you aren't really a Christian. Since Noah was the one righteous man of God on the planet at the time, he must have been persecuted. And what do Christians get persecuted for? Ostensibly for trying to save souls. So that's what Noah must have been doing, right? Sure, fine. But the problem here is that God explicitly told Noah that it was his will that everyone on the planet, except for Noah and his family, would be destroyed. So if Noah tried to save people from that destruction, then he would have put himself in opposition to God's will. Given the context of the story, the idea that Noah tried to save more people than God told him he was allowed to save is just bonkers.
You see, Noah was a preacher of righteousness. Oh, how that godly man wanted people to turn from their pride, to turn from their wrongdoings, and to find safety in God's rescue plan.
Oh, how apologists love to just make shit up for which there is no biblical justification.
The ark. But nothing's changed. Today, men and women stand on street corners and preach that God's judgment is coming, so men and women should prepare.
Maybe you should just re-listen to that bit to see if you can figure out what's wrong with it. For thousands of years now, preachers have been preaching about how the end is nigh. Any moment now. It'll happen soon. Trust me. And so far, they've all been wrong. Now, does that automatically mean that the ones preaching the same message today are also wrong? No, of course not. But they also don't have a very good track record, which is not something you'd expect from people who are getting inside information directly from the all-knowing God of the universe.
And it's sad, because they do think we're out of our minds, because we believe that Jesus Christ will save us, and that he is coming again.
What is it that he's going to save us from exactly? Is it what he'll do to us if we don't worship him? It's from what he'll do to us if we don't worship him, isn't it? You see how that makes him look bad, right? Tell me you see it.
Mark my words, the rain will start to fall, and this generation will one day see the judgment of God that they ignored and laughed at.
Well, I mean, that is what Jesus said about the generation that lived with him 2,000 years ago, so forgive me for not trusting in the dude's punctuality. That's it for this one. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Mr. K4022, who says, deep down, Rhino wants to be an actor? Vice Rhino?
The actor?
This was on the video where I kind of went off the rails with the soy milk and the implying that I murdered someone behind the camera, so I can see where you might have gotten that idea, but no, I'd be a terrible actor. I could probably be a half-decent voice actor, but an actual act in front of the camera actor? No way. First, I can't remember lines for shit. Back when I did Surfshark ads that had me talking to myself as the Tim character, the reason that the character who did most of the talking in those ads was always playing video games is so that I'd have an excuse to not look at the other character, instead looking off camera to a screen that had my lines on it. And I know I don't have the chops to get away with the Marlon Brando method of just having my lines attached to another actor in the scene, but also I have a hard time being inauthentic. If I were cast in a role where a person I'm supposed to like is being played by someone I don't like, I wouldn't be able to fake it. So the closest thing I will ever come to being an actor is doing the ridiculous bits that I sometimes get in my head are a good idea, which of course are completely absent from this video. Thanks for watching. I'll be back next Friday with more, but if you need to get your Rhino fix in before then, I livestream with Cirrus every Wednesday at 8:30 Eastern on my other channel, The Watering Hole. Thanks to Tim Robertson for being my Patreon and sponsorships manager. Thanks to this week's PayPal hero, Charles. And special thanks as always to my patrons, Kate Lee Wren, Deepest Hell, and all the rest, who are the Missoula floods to the channeled scablands that are my channel. If you'd like to cause me to exist but be misrepresented by creationists and pseudo-archaeologists, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino, or by supporting the channel in one of the other methods that can be found at links.vicerhino.com, which is where you'll also find links to my other projects. If for whatever reason you want to send me stuff, my PO Box address is in the description. See you next time! The Wikipedia article for polypatestrostal. Polypatestrostal. Polystraight fossil. These... It fell a bit. Might fall more.